Hello everyone, I welcome you to our channel with another bone-chilling horror story. Sit tight and grab some popcorn if you can. So let's begin. This is the terrifying tale of a cave in the wilderness of Russia that no one dared to enter. But in the 1980s, during a mission, a group of Russian soldiers made the fatal mistake of seeking shelter there. What happened next will haunt you long after the story ends. Let's dive into the dark history of what became known as the Killer Cave. In the summer of 1983, deep in the Russian wilderness near the Ural Mountains, a group of 7 Russian soldiers embarked on a routine patrol mission. Their task was to check on an old, abandoned military outpost that had been inactive since World War II. The soldiers were no strangers to danger, but what awaited them would be far worse than anything they had ever encountered on the battlefield. Sergei Ivanov, the commanding officer, was a tough man in his 40s, hardened by years of combat. With him were his loyal comrades: Mikhail, the sniper with an impeccable aim; Dmitry, the young, energetic engineer fresh out of training; Pavel, the medic known for his cool demeanor in times of crisis; Alexei and Viktor, veteran soldiers who had fought in Afghanistan together; and finally Grigory, the radio operator who kept them connected with their base. They were well prepared for the wilderness, or so they thought. The journey to the outpost began smoothly. The thick trees and endless expanse of forest were familiar terrain for these men. The weather had been favorable, but that changed in the blink of an eye. The clouds darkened and a heavy downpour began out of nowhere. The forest path quickly turned into thick, slippery mud. Continuing their journey in this weather was impossible. The storm grew so fierce that it felt as if the heavens themselves were angry. Thunder cracked through the air like a whip, and the wind howled as if possessed. They needed shelter fast, or the rain would surely compromise their equipment. Through the sheets of rain, Dmitry, with his sharp eyes, spotted a large cave entrance tucked into the side of a hill. Thick vines and overgrown foliage masked its true size, but it was large enough to accommodate the group. The soldiers didn't hesitate and decided to take shelter in the cave, hoping the storm would pass. As they approached the cave, an odd sense of foreboding washed over them, though none of them would admit it at the time. The entrance was cold, unnaturally so for that time of year. The air grew thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the howling wind outside. Dmitry cracked a joke, something about ghosts living in the cave, trying to lighten the mood, but his words echoed eerily, sending chills down their spines. Inside, the cave was massive, its ceilings stretching high above them. There was something strange about the space, as if the walls themselves were watching them. The damp, cold air clung to their skin. Pavel, the medic, mentioned that he didn't like the feeling of the place, but Sergei dismissed it. They had no other choice. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and this was the only refuge. They set up a small fire near the entrance, lighting the dim space with flickering orange and yellow hues. The cave seemed to go on forever, with narrow, twisting tunnels disappearing into the darkness. Mikhail, ever the cautious one, stood watch while the others rested, their nerves slowly easing after the long march. But it didn't take long before things began to go wrong. About an hour after setting up camp, Mikhail, who had been scanning the cave entrance with his flashlight, noticed something odd in the distance. He thought he saw movement, just a flicker in the shadows near the far end of the cave. At first, he wrote it off as the rain playing tricks on his mind, but then he saw it again. A shadow. Moving. Without saying a word, he stood up, his rifle ready, and walked toward the tunnel. The others barely noticed his absence, tired from the long day. When Sergei finally realized Mikhail was gone, he assumed he had simply gone to relieve himself deeper in the cave. But when Mikhail didn't return after several minutes, Sergei became concerned. He called out, but there was no answer. Sergei sent Alexei to check on Mikhail. Alexei, the older of the two veterans, grumbled about the cold as he ventured into the dark tunnel. He called out for Mikhail, but his voice was swallowed by the cave's damp air. Minutes passed, and Alexei, too, didn't return. The tension grew thick. Something wasn't right. Sergei grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the depths of the cave himself, accompanied by Victor. The narrow tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness so thick it felt suffocating. As they moved deeper, a foul odor began to permeate the air like something rotting. The further they went, the louder the whispers became. At first, Sergei thought it was just the wind, but then he realized it was voices, faint, disembodied voices, like the hushed tones of someone speaking just out of sight. Suddenly, a scream pierced the darkness. It was Alexei. The sound was filled with terror, and it echoed off the stone walls, sending a wave of panic through Sergei and Victor. They rushed forward, their flashlights bouncing wildly off the uneven cave floor. But when they reached the spot where the scream had come from, there was nothing. No Alexei. No Mikhail. Just silence and darkness. The men returned to the main camp, their minds racing. By this point, the remaining soldiers were on edge. Grigory tried to get a signal on the radio to contact their base, but all he could hear was static. His hands trembled as he continued to fiddle with the device. That's when he heard it. A voice crackling through the static, faint but unmistakable. It whispered his name. Grigory's face went pale, and the radio slipped from his hands. He looked at Sergei with wide, terrified eyes, saying something was horribly wrong. But before they could process what was happening, the fire flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows on the cave walls. Then, Pavel disappeared. The men had barely turned their backs, and Pavel was gone, just like the others. Sergei called out for him, his voice echoing back at him like a cruel taunt. The air grew colder, and the sense of dread became unbearable. By now, the remaining men were paralyzed with fear. The whispers grew louder, and they could feel something watching them from the shadows. It was no longer just the darkness that they were afraid of, it was what was lurking within it. The night dragged on. Every hour felt like an eternity as they huddled by the dimming fire. Sergei, trying to keep the remaining soldiers calm, devised a plan to leave the cave at first light. But dawn seemed impossibly far away. One by one, the soldiers began to slip away into madness. Grigory, convinced that the voices were calling to him, vanished into the blackness, his screams echoing back moments later. Now, only Sergei and Dmitri remained, trapped in the haunted cave. Sergei, determined to survive, kept his rifle trained on the darkness, but he knew it was futile. Whatever was in the cave wasn't human, and bullets wouldn't stop it. Dmitri, barely holding on to his sanity, muttered to himself about seeing shadows move, about feeling cold hands brush against his skin. The hours passed like a slow nightmare. Then, just before dawn, they heard a deep, guttural growl from the depths of the cave. It was unlike anything they had ever heard before. A sound so primal and terrifying that it sent chills through their bodies. Sergei knew they had to escape before the thing inside the cave claimed them too. Grabbing Dmitri, they made a break for the cave entrance, stumbling through the dark tunnels, the growls growing louder behind them. The air grew colder with every step, and they could feel the presence of the entity closing in on them. Finally, they saw the faint light of dawn breaking through the cave entrance. Sergei and Dmitri bolted toward it, their hearts pounding in their chests. Just as they reached the mouth of the cave, Dmitri let out a scream. Something had grabbed him, pulling him back into the darkness. Sergei turned and fired blindly into the black void, but it was too late. Dmitri was gone. Sergei burst out of the cave, the rain-soaked earth welcoming him like a lifeline. He collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, his heart still racing. He didn't stop running until he reached the nearest town, where he reported the incident. But no one believed him. They searched the cave, but found no trace of his comrades. It was as if the cave itself had swallowed them whole. To this day, the locals speak of the cave with fear and reverence, warning travelers to stay away from it. Some say the cave is cursed, others say it's haunted by an ancient demon. But whatever it is, it's still there, waiting for its next victims. Like and subscribe to our channel for more amazing horror stories.